Akash Singh and you're watching my YouTube channel, Views, Reviews and Interviews. I'm going to be reviewing Zizek's newest book on Hegel, Hegel in a Wired Brain, published by Bloomsbury in 2020. Before I give my remarks on Zizek's Hegel, I'm just going to mention Zizek's review of my own book on Hegel, and I do so for two sorts of reasons. In Hegel's India, a book that sort of discusses the interface of the impact of Indian thought on Hegel's philosophy, Zizek wrote, Hegel's India takes the challenge of a detailed reading of Hegel's texts with a surprising result. Beyond Hegel's dismissal of India, there lies not only his profound fascination with India, but also an uncanny proximity between India's ancient wisdom and Hegel's speculative thought. And the review is a bit longer, but just wanted to point out, first of all, that Zizek is quite aware, obviously, of Hegel's encounter with the sort of non-Occidental thought. And secondly, the review is very, very kind. Zizek has always been exceptionally charitable in reading my writings on Hegel and other works. And unfortunately, so I feel like a bit of a backstabber, because what I have to say about his newest Hegel book is not so kind. I think it's a deeply flawed work, and that brings me to the other reason that I mentioned Zizek's remarks on my own Hegel book. It's flawed precisely because of the way that Zizek seems to have this amnesia about the way that Hegelian thought transcended Occidental thinking and moved to try to understand and explore the world from other locations. Now, he does that, of course, in a racist and Orientalist fashion and so on, but that's not the point that is relevant. So now, Hegel in a Wired Brain suffers from a great defect that I'll get to at the end, but at the beginning, I mean, it is just, as usual, a brilliant piece of writing, a brilliant piece of sort of polymath learning. The prose is fairly accessible, especially for someone who's talking on a subject at the interface of German idealism, Freudian and Lacanian psychoanalysis, and AI, and the future of the interface of digital technologies with human consciousness. Now, these are not easy subjects, and yet Zizek writes about them with such panache and his usual wit and brilliance. So, quick look at the table of contents. Starts with an introduction. The introduction is really appealing because, as I had mentioned, these are difficult concepts. Hegelian concepts, Lacanian concepts, and then the series of considerations related to singularity, or the moment of emerging of the human mind with some sort of digital technologies, like an AI or simply a network of wired brains. So this introduction more or less caricatures that much of, let's say, Hegel that would need to be understood by the reader in order to get through how Zizek approaches the subject of singularity from the vantage point of Hegelian thought. In the first chapter, The Digital Police State, Fichte's Revenge on Hegel, already we see that he's getting into questions of German ideology, but he does so in order more or less to ask very basic questions. What is the status of surveillance in relationship to contemporary times? How free are we? What is the status of social freedom in contemporary democracies? In the second chapter, the idea of a wired brain gets into the very basics about what is he referring to, the idea, the notion of singularity, the notion of Neuralink, developed and discussed by Elon Musk, the connection of the human brain to a network, and thereby the ability to sort of upload thoughts and merge thought, and therefore possibly merge consciousness, person with machine. And since many persons' brains can be uploaded to this machine, possibly even person to person, mediated through this machine. So the basics about this, and what's worth noting is that Žižek's question is such a thing going to be possible? He just takes it for granted. It's about when it happens, what do we make of it? I mean, what are the philosophical implications for us now, knowing that this is, in a way, an inevitable future? The third chapter, the impasse of Soviet tech gnosis. So if we think about defects of mass experiments such as Soviet communism, hand in hand with the digital technology of surveillance that we have today, which is linked to capitalism, of course, what we get is a kind of initial shock or fright about what the possibilities are of each of us being wired and in this way super surveilled. I mean, it's surveillance capitalism is one thing, and the idea of a wired brain in a network is a complete quantum leap beyond that. The fourth chapter is on singularity, the Gnostic turn. So the idea of Gnosticism that Žižek is evoking, maybe I will just discuss an aspect of it. So basically, when Elon Musk describes Neuralink, now it's not quite fair that Žižek treats Musk's statements as he would Marx's statements or Hegel's statements, or the writing of a great philosopher. Nevertheless, Žižek takes Musk's statements and examines them, subjects them to a certain kind of scrutiny. And one of the things that Musk discusses when he's talking about Neuralink is the way that thoughts can be in some way uploaded, and yet these thoughts can only be uploaded if the person, if the subject or the agent wills them to be uploaded. Once uploaded, these thoughts can be downloaded by others. So in other words, sorts of experience, my personal experience, subjective experience, can then become implanted in a connected brain and become the subjective felt experience of another. Now, this raises two questions for Žižek. One is the presupposition that a thought is somehow free from language, that thought is in some way free-formed and is not contingent or constituted by language. And this notion is, I think, according to Žižek, sort of the great folly of the way that contemporary non-philosophers are thinking about things like singularity, because language conditions experience, and the idea that experience can be liberated from language, treated as a kind of unit of information and then sent around to be downloaded by others, is a very naive approach to the relation or to the structure of human thought and experience, which is always, according to Žižek, mediated by language. Now, I don't I said I threw in that according to Žižek because I don't agree, but that doesn't matter. This is Žižek's argument. The fifth chapter is on the idea of the fall. So he's evoking now a classical biblical idea, the fall from paradise, and let's say the rupture from Godhead, and then this eventual redemption, and what the redemption of humanity is with respect to the fall. And why is that? Because obviously the fall in this biblical sense is related to having a kind of godlike knowledge. And this godlike knowledge is something that is in a way promised by singularity, because the limitations of the human mind and possibly of human experience and consciousness, for example, that my subjective feelings, emotions, and experiences are exclusively mine, but that idea now, it gets thrown out the window because they're not exclusively mine, they are in fact shareable. So all of these transformations seem to make us godlike in a sense. So are they then redemptive? Just like the Christian story has the redemption after the fall. So Žižek gets into a kind of theology, political theology, discussion of how the singularity is can be read in relationship to this idea of fall and redemption. The sixth chapter turns completely away from Hegel and goes towards Freud and Lacan, because Žižek wants to bring in the idea of the unconscious also. So it's one whole set of problems to think about how the conscious mind, so the brain is wired, by the brain being wired, the network has access to the mind. But when we think about the mind, then obviously we're thinking about the conscious mind. Now, what is the access that the network has to the unconscious mind, especially when the conscious mind itself has no access, or has only a few strange avenues of access to the unconscious mind? And so since Žižek wants to raise yet this further complication to the whole idea of the ontology and the morality and the notion of subjectivity with the person, the post-human person, the sort of person unshackled by traditional fetters of what it means to be human, wired to some objective consciousness, objective processor that might be able to bring in other brains and minds. Since Žižek wants to deal with the realm of the unconscious in this relationship, he has to turn, of course, away from Hegel as a dominant perspective and move towards psychoanalysis and Lacan. And then there's a final chapter, a literary fantasy, and an epilogue, which is really strange piece of writing, a treatise on the digital apocalypse, which he discusses apocalypse, the fall again, the libidinal economy of singularity, because Žižek is quite obsessed with sexuality in this, given that sexuality is kind of the condition, basic condition of human experience, and I mean basic as in base condition of human experience. And so how does this sexuality fit into the post-human scenario? And a final section in this weird epilogue on the end of history. And I think that becomes quite important, because what we see here once again is that what Žižek is doing in this text, touching on many of the motifs that have been going on for a long time in his writing. On the one hand, defending the kind of Pauline Christian worldview from threats that come from things like Islamic political theology, or the threat to the Christian ontology by this kind of attack of Buddhism. So, you know, in many of his writings in political theology, he targets Buddhism as decaying, as being decadent of certain fundamental Western or European values that St. Paul's Christendom or Christianity should preserve, or should be revitalized in order to preserve European Christendom. So he's made these kinds of gestures to preserve and protect European Christendom from attacks from without, and now it seems he's doing it from within. So maybe this technology, which he kind of Eurocentrically attributes to being Western technology, anyone who understands this knows that that's not a very apt characterization of it. But anyway, so now he's going to preserve European or Pauline Christianity from threats from within, like eating itself through its own technological innovation. Well, there's so many things then, if that sort of touches on the chapters, there's so many things to say about this. So I'm going to discuss just one of the things that I think is most fascinating, and then I'm going to get to the biggest defect, which I've already in a way hinted at, which is this doubling down on this kind of eurocentrism that Žižek has been really digging his heels into for quite some time. Now, when we talk about singularity or the wired brain, we're talking about a kind of fusion or unity of my subjectivity with an object, something external to me, like the computer or the network, and then potential further fusions with other subjectivities with that object, and eventually a kind of unity of subjectivity and objectivity, and a kind of godlike knowledge and access and transcendence of our limitations that emerges, which is something like what Hegel would refer to as the absolute. And so what we get with the singularity is a very, very beautiful mimicry of the entire teleological orientation of Hegel's dialectics. So the unity of subjectivity and objectivity, and the emergence of the absolute in another context, let's say in the aesthetic context for Hegel, the unity of a form and content, or in logic, the unity of mind and material. And why I bring this up is because in these dialectical movements of Hegel, where you get unity of subject and object, and emergence of the absolute, or unity of mind and material, this happens through a process, a long logical, metaphysical, historical process that Hegel sketches. But put that aside and look at the singularity. In the singularity, you're getting a unity of subject and object, a unity of mind and material. This digital technology is just a machine, after all. And you're getting this without ontology. You're getting it without a teleological history that in some way looks back to justify it, and so on. So in some way, Žižek is offended at the way that someone like Elon Musk gets to have the absolute and not pay for it, not in terms of the slaughter bench of history and all of these ways that Hegel speaks about how we pay for our the freedom and the absolute that emerges after so much blood, sweat, and tears. Now, whenever anyone starts to claim that they can achieve something by abandoning ontology, you know that gets Žižek very alarmed and annoyed. We've seen these kinds of assaults, for example, on the naivety of political liberalism, which thinks that it can have a political and not metaphysical conception of justice, obviously Žižek would respond that that very claim is itself a metaphysical claim. So Žižek has for many decades actually come to the rescue in some respects of classical ontological questions and conundrums when people think that they just bypass them. So this is a really fascinating representation of singularity that I think is one of the major insights of putting Hegel and these kinds of tech questions together, because there's a sense in which everything Hegel was always after gets intriguingly captured in this notion of Neuralink. But that doesn't mean that all of the philosophical implications, the ethical and the linguistic and the phenomenological and the ontological can be bypassed. And what Žižek's book is all about is playing around with all of those conundrums. Now the thing is, how does Žižek approach it? And the way, in a nutshell, he approaches it with a kind of fear and loathing. Now it's very common that philosophers should fear and loathe technology. It's happened since as long as Western philosophy has existed. I mean, think back to, it is the Phaedrus, I believe, of Plato, where Phaedrus is hiding the scroll because he doesn't want Socrates to see that he has the text written. So there's this critique already of the written word. There are, I mean, and this just goes on and on. Francis Bacon, you remember in, what work was it from the Enlightenment? Okay, so you have these Galen, you have these, I just remember throughout the history of ideas how new technologies have evoked all sorts of contempt from established philosophical or theological community. Marshall McLuhan talks about this backlash against the Gutenberg printing press, where people bemoaned the loss of script. And William James, I remember around the turn of the century, last century, William James is discussing this idea of people who are so much opposed to the steam engine. You can think of Gandhi and his opposition to these modern technologies, the telephone, telegraphs, railways. And I mean, it just goes on and on. Heidegger, and then of course Habermas and his great response to biotechnologies. And then here we have Žižek. So Žižek follows a very long line of philosophers who express great fear and contempt of new technologies. Now the funny thing is that he presents himself as being totally open and embracing them. The thing is, he's not open, and he's far from embracing. And you see this fear and contempt come in the little digs that he takes against the ideas of people like Elon Musk, as I had mentioned, that are just merely stated casually by him. But most significantly, we can see the way that what Žižek is doing is once again merging this kind of reactionary style of his thinking, rescuing Christianity, rescuing classical basic ideas of European Christendom from threats from without, and you see that he's applying them now from threats from within. So it's the traditional reactionary Žižek that we're seeing here, and this is this can get characterized by the way that he'll make remarks like, great filmmakers know that when we switched from black and white film to color, it was popularly expressed that we gain something because black and white film is a lack that is, and that lack gets filled in by the color. But anyone who really knows cinema or film knows that we lost something. And this kind of romantic, nostalgic idea of a simpler past really permeates Zizek's book. It does so in these kinds of examples, and it does so in the very core logic of his argument, which is that in some respects the entire project of wiring a brain assumes this correlation of brain, mind, and spirit that is juvenile from the philosophical point of view. So, so this is one thing, this kind of reactionary and romantic attitude that he has. But to get back to the very start, where I had read Zizek's remarks about my Hegel book, Hegel's India, what we really get a sense of here is Zizek's limitations in terms of having exclusively and entirely submerging himself in the Western traditions and its confines and the ways that it thinks, the resources that it has. And when you're dealing with transcending subjectivity, one also has to think about transcending eurocentrism. And one, the idea that the entirety of human experience, even digital future technologies, can be captured through classical notions like the fall and the redemption of Christ and things like this, is very, very short-sighted, very limited in terms of the future possibilities of technologies that definitely transcend not merely subjectivities but also identities, and in these processes also the peculiar histories that give rise to fixed identities like white European male, the one that Žižek is so closely attached to. So the heavy Eurocentrism comes out in this work as one of the great weaknesses of the author's imagination. So he's dealing with his copious learning within the context of Western philosophy, literature, cinema, and comedy. But he's completely at a loss to approach something that transcends the experience available in this background. And so what he assumes makes this fatally flawed assumption that therefore it is in some way touching on an ineffability. But to go from I don't have the resources to deal with it to it cannot be dealt with is a really great error. And clearly, if Žižek paid more attention to the ways in which, for example, those ontologies and epistemologies and moral philosophies and aesthetics and so on, that he simply has been rejecting and trying to remove from European awareness for the last several decades, if he engaged with them the way that Hegel did in his own writings, then Žižek would have found himself with an entirely new set of resources for how to articulate what to him seems completely otherworldly and inassimilable. So this is a few remarks about Žižek's new book. It is very readable, as I had said. It's very short and accessible, especially for a work dealing with such complicated concepts. And it's even funny. I'll end with one of Žižek's classical jokes that he uses to try to get into why it is that a wired brain will never be as, let's say, appealing a phenomenon as simple human subjectivity. So what is the fundamental flaw in post-humanism? He says that a guy goes into a cafe and he says that I'd like a coffee without cream, please. The waiter says, I'm sorry, sir, we don't have cream, we use milk. So all I can offer you is a coffee without milk. And it's a great joke, kind of opens up this subtlety that Žižek is trying to suggest. It lies there within the limits of human subjectivity, which is that, you know, what if every day I have coffee with cream, and so today I decided I want my coffee without cream. In that sense, even though coffee without cream and coffee without milk are both just black coffee, that whole subjective history that goes into my request for coffee without cream is a different phenomenon from just black coffee. And a computer, according to Žižek, this is part of his sort of reactionary approach, a computer can only cope with black coffee. It's not able to and will not be able to ascertain the nuances of habit and experience that go into making coffee without milk a different phenomenon from coffee without cream, and a different phenomenon from black coffee, because for the computer they are all just one and the same.